It's The Log. I'm Charles Purcell. Well, let's start here. Let's talk consequences. Consequences. That seemed to be a developing angle in the news coverage yesterday. Republican donors ending their relationships with Republicans, especially House and Senate Republicans who voted to object to the Electoral College votes. Let me step back just for a second to say, let's all be careful not to just follow what the news media has decided is today's angle. So I'm not going to fall into that trap. I am going to follow this vein for a little bit, but with that warning and with caution on my part, without too much of a sidetrack here, it's worth a reminder that the news media operates on profit. And so they have to have eyeballs, they have to have clicks. I know this is obvious, and I know I've said it 100 times or 1,000 times, but it bears repeating, and it's worth a reminder. They're in competition with the other media outlets, with the other news outlets. They have to have something fresh, something new every day, every news cycle. And that suits their business model. It doesn't serve journalism. It doesn't serve us. It's not that they're lying to us. It's not that they're fake news. No. They're still, by and large, good journalists doing the best they can. But the writer on the beat doesn't decide what's going to get the 3-inch headline on the front page. The producer in the field doesn't get to decide which story is going to get top billing on that evening's telecast. Those decisions are made by people higher in the organization, and their primary concern is viewers and readers and clickers. Now, they'll be very quick to defend themselves. They'll say, well, we have to stay in business. If we go out of business, how are we going to do any good at all? How are we going to inform the public if we're not even in business? We have to do this. Well, yeah, I suppose there's no real arguing with that. But that gets us into a much larger topic with much larger questions and much larger solutions. Now we get into my beautiful utopian world with no money, and we're not there. So I'm not going to engage in that argument in the moment. Yeah, I don't know. I guess if you're a for-profit entity and you're in competition with other for-profit news entities, I guess your hands are tied. I don't know. I'm not going to have that argument. Right now, the purpose of this little monologue is to remind myself more than anything, but as long as you're along for the ride here, I will remind you as well that this is what's happening in the news media that you consume. So beware. For example, what we talked about yesterday. At length, we talked about the cops in the United States, military, infiltration of white supremacists, whether or not they were quote-unquote in on it, on the insurrection. Don't let that just be one day's news angle. It's so easy to fall into that trap, and really understandable. But what's lost, then, is the bigger picture. What's lost are the connections between the different aspects of the story, how they relate to each other, how they inform each other, how they come together in this elaborate Venn diagram to create the picture we really need to understand. And more importantly, or just as importantly, lawmakers need to understand, decision makers, the ones who are making policy, the ones who are enforcing the rules of the road here, and hopefully creating legislation for a better future. And if we want to fulfill this fantasy of actually living in a democracy where we have something to say about that, well, then my advice this morning goes to everybody. You, me, John Q. Public, and office holders up and down the line, local, state, and feds. So, there's my sidetrack. Please do not get pulled around by the nose by a profit-driven news media. That's why I keep begging you to go to the nonprofits, go to the non-corporate, anti-corporate, independent news sources. Get the facts you need from sources that are not dictated to by that bottom line. You're going to get a lot of the same facts the day of a big news story, but then you're going to get follow-up, and you're going to get analysis and attention to the connections I was talking about. Be very, very wary of the corporate media these days. We know what they did to us, even the well-intentioned ones. We know what they did to us at the outset of the Iraq War. We know what they did. We know what they did all through the 2016 primary campaign when the Orange Menace became actually viable. The corporate media, the corporate news media, can take the lion's share of the credit for that one. This guy likely would have never won the presidency without the constant 24-hour hype of the corporate news media that had nothing but dollar signs in their eyes. All right, enough said. Back to the topic at hand. We're talking about consequences. And this is a very nice little development, and I hope it continues. I hope it's not a one-day story. People do it to feel good and then doesn't have any lasting impact. But it looks like it's actually happening. In Texas and Wisconsin, I don't know where else, those are the ones I know about. Important, influential local newspapers are calling for the resignation or the expulsion of their own senators. Ted Cruz, of course, in Texas. Ron Johnson here in Wisconsin. That's good. Consequences. Looking at a headline right now from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. National veterans groups plan to purge members found guilty in Capitol attack. There you go. Getting a lot of attention, of course, is big tech. Google, Apple, Amazon, disassociating themselves with Parler, the right-wing radical social media platform that was central to the planning of the insurrectionists. Yeah, if you haven't heard, I'm sure you probably have, Parler really is just basically gone now. First, Google and Apple took them off their app stores, and other vendors took away any kind of tech support they were getting from them. But then the big move was from Amazon when they withdrew their services as their host site. You have to, if you want to be online, somebody has to host you. Somebody's got to push the right buttons and get you into the right tubes, as they say. Wires and tubes. We here rely on the good people of Libsyn, Liberated Syndication. Libsyn is our host site. Anyway, yeah, that's how it works. Consequences. Unlike the guy in Iowa, that was a headline caught my eye too. Why am I laughing? Let off with pretty much nothing. The guy who drove into the Iowa protesters, yeah, a little fine, a little slap on the wrist, nothing. Let's see, who else? Blue Cross Blue Shield, one of the many, many corporations who are severing ties with Republicans. So this is good. This is very good. Consequences. And these consequences can take different forms. Of course, there's the legal. You got to find them, arrest them, put them in jail. There are social consequences. This is something we hear from anti-racism experts. One of the most important things you can do is in your own social circle. You don't laugh at the racist joke. You call out the casual racist comment. You don't allow it in your presence. There are consequences for your brother, your sister-in-law, your friend, your aunt, your uncle, your buddy. If people don't suffer the consequences of their actions, then the behavior never changes. In fact, just the opposite. It's reinforced. It's enabled. People getting fired from their jobs left and right all over the country. People who participated in this attack are being fired from their jobs. Yeah, that's good. Now, the right wing will call it cancel culture. That's their favorite thing. They'll yell about freedom. But if there aren't consequences for lawless, dangerous insurrection, well, then where are we? All right, it's really important now that I take this line of thought down a bit of an uncomfortable path. Because a lot of folks have been comparing the unrest over the summer in the protests for racial justice with what happened last Wednesday. And what I've said so far to you today might make me sound like a hypocrite. And you can start both siding this thing. So, the big liberal Charles Purcell is now calling for law and order? Calling for the consequences of wrongdoers? Aren't you the same guy who said, I don't care if a Target gets torched in Minneapolis? I don't really give a damn about a few broken windows, burned cars. This is the inevitable result of people being jackbooted for generations. Well, isn't that exactly the same argument that the so-called MAGA protesters were making? We want our freedom. How did Martin Luther King define a riot? The language of the unheard? Well, isn't that just all the same? They sure do look the same on the TV. Well, I tell you, I'm comfortable in my stand, and I don't feel I need to go back and alter anything I said earlier over the summer. There's some pretty fundamental differences. The most important one being what the protesters, demonstrators, rioters, whatever you want to call them, whatever the people on the street are fighting for, well, they're diametrically different. The current rioters, demonstrators, are fighting for a lie, something that's simply not true. The Orange Menace did not win the last election by a landslide. The country, the government, has not been stolen from them. They're fighting on behalf of a twisted, militarized Christianity. They are fighting to preserve white supremacy, which they've enjoyed now for a couple of hundred years, and they damn well don't want to give up. Another pretty simple fact that I don't really think you can argue. I don't recall any Black Lives Matter protesters armed with swords, guns, clubs, mace, threatening the lives of anybody. I don't remember them chanting about who they wanted to hang or who they wanted to shoot. These people at the Capitol, man, they were out for blood, and we all saw it. Let's look at the very worst images we can find of the summer Black Lives Matter protests. Now, there were some pretty bad scenes in Portland, in Minneapolis, in Kenosha. Buildings torched, cars torched, windows shattered, stores looted. I'm being very, very careful here. I don't want to excuse any of this, but I'll repeat what I've said many times. I don't excuse any of it, but I understand most of it. It is the language of the unheard. It's 400 years of oppression and subjugation and abuse and violence and enslavement and torture coming home to roost at a level that actually is shockingly small. Compared to the crime of 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and the carceral state, compared to that crime, a few broken windows and a couple of torched taxis, come on. And let's also be real quick here to point out that countless investigations have shown that of all the destructive acts, the fires, the looting, the shattered windows, a tiny percentage of that were legitimate protesters. 90% plus were outside agitators, people coming in from outside the movement to have a little fun, or white supremacists coming in and posing as protesters to increase the level of havoc. This is not speculation, this is fact. And we've now had a few months to find them, to identify them, to arrest them. And those are the numbers, people. Local law enforcement, FBI, everybody in on this gives us the same report. Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful. The images you saw on the news, on the profit-driven news, were misleading, to put it charitably, were lies, to put it accurately. Now let's talk about cops for a minute. News media's favorite term, clashes with police. Heard it again just last night. Heard it several times. I'm watching a video. You probably saw it. Just came out yesterday. On the steps, a Capitol police officer being dragged into the crowd, being beaten mercilessly with an American flag. Another one up on the steps, getting the same treatment. We've seen the images by now. The insurrectionists attacking Capitol security, while the news anchor so casually says, "Oh, here are protesters clashing with police." You know what? Right here in Milwaukee, when I saw a Black Lives Matter protester standing with his bicycle, doing nothing. I watched on a live stream as he was tackled by half a dozen cops in full riot gear, slammed to the ground, cuffed and detained. And you know what the anchor said while that footage was rolling? Protesters clashing with police. Yeah, you want to compare these two? You're going to have to bring your choir together and preach to them, because it doesn't fly in any court of reality. So there is a lot of hypocrisy out there. Over that long, hot summer, when every Republican you could find was using very similar language to what I'm using today. We cannot have insurrection. That's what they called it. That's what they called Black Lives Matter, insurrection. They must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Yeah, I'm saying that today about actual insurrection. And I'm sorry to say that some on the left are falling into that trap. Now all of a sudden, they want new terror laws. There are voices from both left and right calling for tougher laws, limiting the rights of protesters because of what happened last week. Don't go down that road. We don't need new laws that would limit the rights of all protesters to prevent future crimes that look like last week. No, last week was already clearly against the law, against the most stringent laws we have on the books. Sedition, insurrection, physically attacking your own government, treason. There are no tougher laws on the books than in this area. So, Democrats, those of us on the left are counting on you to at least be a reasonable buffer against the radical right-wingers. Democrats, we lefties, we'll have our little political fights with you. We'll duke it out on the political field. That's fine. You're a worthy opponent. But for the love of God, don't go down this road with the right-wingers who you share the halls of power with. No. Don't get all scared and say we need new domestic terrorism laws. No, we're good. We're good. The laws are all right. Just find the real perps and be sure they suffer the consequences of their actions. Which brings us back to the original theme here of today. Consequences. We're already hearing the chorus from the Joe Biden centrists about reconciliation, about healing, about coming together. You know what? F that. We're hearing the same thing from an awful lot of conservatives, Republicans, because that's the best argument they can muster. They no longer have any defense at all for the rioters. They have no defense at all for the Orange Menace. So all they have left is to get in bed with Joe Biden and say, oh, let's heal. Let's move forward. You know what? Let's talk about moving forward. Well, the people guilty of the insurrection are moving forward in their own way. They're already planning for armed protests at every state capital and in D.C. So they're moving forward with their plans. They may not have Parler anymore, but they're finding ways to communicate. They're rearming. They still have their guns and ammo. They still have their Viking horns and spears, their zip-tie handcuffs, their mace, their gallows and noose. They're all ready to load up again, go to every state capital this weekend. It's on their calendar, as is January 20th, when they're going to descend on Washington, D.C. again and make every attempt to disrupt or even stop the inauguration of Joe Biden. And it's not one little bit alarmist to just assume that 1 or 2 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 of them aren't making actual, actionable plans as we speak to kill Joe Biden. That's not alarmist. That's about the safest assumption a person can make right now. Outgoing acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, as he's walking out the door, grants the mayor of Washington's request for a state of emergency. Of course, the headline says that the Orange Menace granted it, but he's no longer president. He's not governing. He's just in his bunker ranting. So it doesn't take much to imagine that scene. Muriel Bowser calls up Homeland Security. Hey, we need the state of emergency. Chad Wolf on the way out the door. Hey, Chad, the mayor wants to talk to you. What does she want? State of emergency. Yeah, sure, fine. What the hell do I care? Slams the door, walks out. Coward. Yeah, he and DeVos and Chow, 3 high-profile cabinet secretaries who have resigned. Cowards. Stay there and do your job. Invoke the 25th. Joe Biden had this brilliant idea. This is what happens when you let Joe Biden think for himself. Well, let's see. Could you work a half a day on impeachment? He's talking to Congress now. And then work half a day on my stuff? What a dim bulb this guy is. Never had an original idea in his life. And when he does, this is what it sounds like. The current Pentagon, we got to look at their initial report, a press release from Saturday. And they called this historic, deadly event, quote, January 6, 2021, First Amendment protests in Washington, D.C. That's what they called it. That's their first draft of history, as we're all moving forward. Talk about Orwellian. Of course, the Pentagon leadership, as you know, like most of the executive branch, has been purged of all independent thought and stuffed with loyalists, as the United States government has become this weird sort of tin pot dictatorship. And one by one, tick them off. Every agency, all the way up to the Pentagon, stripped of their independence, stripped of their legitimacy, and packed with bootlickers. Even the number 1 bootlicker, Bill Barr, wasn't loyal enough, and he's gone, replaced by another sycophant. So we just want to move forward? Think that January 20th is some sort of magical day where the world just changes? Nope. There have to be consequences. They need to be harsh. They need to be immediate, unwavering. There can be no talk of moving forward, of healing, while we're still in this state of emergency, while we are in imminent danger from both the Orange Menace and what has now become a literal army across the nation, and they're going to get together and raise hell again this weekend in every state capital and raise hell on January 20th in D.C. This is happening now. It's not a story from last night's news. And all the more reason to continue beating the drum for impeachment and the 25th Amendment and calls for resignation. Every day that passes, every hour that passes, every minute that passes is a dangerous one. We've been calling for impeachment. We've been calling for the 25th Amendment for a year, ever since the last impeachment failed. I'm not one least little bit shy about saying I told you so. I encourage everyone who's been fighting this fight to go ahead and indulge in a little I told you so. Who deserves that small pleasure more than we do? So somehow, for Nancy Pelosi, for the Republicans, for literally everybody you can name, this is what crossed the line. No, the almost certain expectation that we would reach this line, that wasn't enough for them. They had to see it. Okay, you've seen it. I think I mentioned yesterday one of the reasons Mike Pence is holding back, I think he fears for his own life. Why wouldn't he? Casey Hunt, Capitol correspondent from NBC News, reported on Sunday that Republican congressional members, who she wouldn't name, told her that they went along with the objections, the Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley-led electoral vote objections, not because they agreed, but because they feared for their safety and for the safety of their families. Yeah. Did you hear that? Let me say it again. members of Congress voted to continue the big lie, objected to the rightful votes of Joseph Robinette Biden because they feared for their safety and the safety of their families. How crazy is this? Now, as far as impeachment goes, and it looks like it's going to happen, that's pretty much a done deal. It's going to happen. They're going to vote for it this week. But those damn Democrats, they're making the same mistake they made before. They can't not be lawyers. You know, an article of impeachment, there's no handbook in the Constitution that says exactly how it's supposed to be written. You don't have to write it up like a lawyer's brief. You really don't. The whole crime and misdemeanor thing, if you let the Republicans turn that into an exercise in minutia of parsing the language, of getting all Clarence Darrow on you, you can never win. You can never win an argument like that. You can always find some convoluted argument. The how many angels fit on the head of a pin argument. So they're doing it again. They zero right in on the word incitement. And they put it in such a legal framework that an opposing counsel can just pull out his freshman law books and make a rhetorical argument against the exact definition of incitement. And then you have to go back to the text of the speech. You're just setting yourself up for failure. You're never going to get a conviction if you go that way. We've known for years about how the Orange Menace uses the old mob boss technique of plausible deniability. It's dog whistles. It's code words. He walks you right up to the line. And if he makes a little slip up, oh, well, he can say he was just being metaphorical or making a joke. Democrats, you're always giving them an out. You're making the same mistake again. First of all, the articles of impeachment, and I say articles, plural, you're only giving us one. You're hanging your hat entirely on incitement. Instead of writing this arcane collar and suspenders legalese, you should have just written it in plain language. This is a bad, bad guy. And not one article of impeachment, no, a dozen of them. Throw the book at him, everything he's done, witness intimidation, pardoning war criminals, pardoning co-conspirators, every election-related lie, apologizing for Charlottesville Nazis, family separation, the phone call to the Georgia Secretary of State. Just tick down the list. Go down everything. Negligent homicide over COVID. He's a damn mass murderer. The founders didn't tell you you had to be f***ing Clarence Darrow writing up your articles of impeachment. Don't make a legal argument, make a moral argument. Just put it down on paper plain. This guy has done A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, and just list them all. And his last little trick when people died, including 2 Capitol police officers. When there were armed marauders in the halls of the Capitol, literally hunting for Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi to kill them. That's what you put in the article of impeachment. And then you go ahead and invite the Republicans to argue with that. Impeachment is not a legal procedure. It is a political procedure. There's a difference. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I'm just a dummy with a microphone, and I know that. All right, that's my time. Tip your servers. I love you. I'm Charles Purcell.